Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. We have an absolutely fantastic panel to kick off this day with. They're both, of course, among the most accomplished authors of this day. They also have a love and, in some cases, occasionally a hate relationship with the new media. They've used it in pursuit of what they've been trying to do. Harry, in particular, has also been using it for some of the social activism that he's done recently, including occupying Wall Street. Shashi has used it to raise lots of issues. He's occasionally been singed by it as well. So why don't I just get straight to it and allow you to talk instead of me doing all the talking. We're talking about the promise and the perils of new media, and who better than you, Shashi, to talk about the perils of it? I can't think of too many people who may have lost their jobs thanks to new media.
Well. No, actually, I think the exciting thing about new media, or the perils of it, were probably greater for the likes of Hosni Mubarak than for poor old Shashi Tharoor. I mean, what's interesting...
in a sense, both of you could have lost your jobs thanks to new media.
Well, at least there's been this argument that the so-called Arab Spring was fueled by new media. I'm not actually totally sold on that. But there has been this perception. In fact, apparently an Egyptian father named his daughter Facebook. And there's a wonderful piece of internet graffiti going around which shows the word Egypt made up of the E of email and the G of Google and the Y of Yahoo and so on, and T of Twitter. Forgotten what the P was, but anyway, that is essentially the perception across the West. I would argue that it may have something to do with helping generate change, but that probably in the Arab world, the sort of one generation earlier, mass television, satellite television, and SMSs may have had a bigger contributory role in actually changing what happened in the Arab world and actually getting people together to articulate their frustrations with the Arab regimes that then eventually came down. But what this whole thing has demonstrated is that, yes, there are perils, as you put it. With new media, it's a great way of actually going viral over an issue. It's a tremendously effective way of intensifying a set of feelings. And the sustainability of the protests that we saw in Tahrir Square or indeed earlier in Tunisia, that sustainability might not have been possible without new media to kick it off and keep it running.
I think that's a fair comment, actually. It's an organizational tool rather than something that's going to create the political sentiment that will drive a movement like that. And certainly in situations like Egypt, where the mass media isn't trusted by the vast majority of the people, it's possible for alternate messages to get out about what's happening, especially when those events are very fast moving, like things that were happening in Tahrir and things that have happened since the date of the revolution. Old media happening. Do you want to take that?
No, I'll try and put that on silent. So much for giving instructions to everyone to switch off your mobile phone.
Now you have got to make sure that it's on Hazare mode. Maun Vrat.
Maun Vrat. Okay, Hurukai. So, perils of new media and mobile phones.
As demonstrated here.
As demonstrated. Sorry, so I just want to get into this now. When you're doing a movement, whether it's Tahrir Square or people thought you were actually present at Tahrir Square, though you were sitting in California.
Well, I, like many people around the world, became obsessed with what was going on in Egypt and Tunisia, and very frustrated by the very, very poor coverage, certainly in the early days, that was happening from broadcast media in UK and the US and in other places. That, had I relied on CNN or various of the other news sources, broadcast news sources, I really wouldn't have understood the situation, let alone had a proper view of what was happening. But by following key people on Twitter, there's a journalist called Andy Carvin, who's a national public radio journalist in the States, who curated a huge feed of different sources from across the Arab world and was basically acting as a conduit for information to people like me who didn't have any sort of interface to the activists who were directly making this happen. And by following him and then kind of hopping over him to start following people that he was retweeting a lot, I rapidly got to the stage where almost as soon as something was happening, I would be aware of it. I had a particularly sort of intense experience. I was following a lot of people from Bahrain, when the activists were in the Pearl roundabout in the center of Bahrain, and I happened to be awake and online when this flurry of tweets came into my timeline saying the police are moving in, they're beating us, they're shooting us, and I just basically started forwarding this information to my followers, as many other people were doing. So this sort of spread virally, this news, more or less in real time. So it's that kind of involvement. And from a distance, if you're not maybe paying attention terribly closely, you see a guy with a funny non-Western name and a brown face in his profile. I was getting these, "You're so brave, stay safe" tweets. And I was at Venice Beach in California. I mean, I was so far away from danger.
You could have to worry about your safety there too.
Of course, in a different way.
In a different
Run
way.
over by a skateboarder.
Shashi, this is of course the promise of new media, but can we overstate the promise? In a country like India where so many people just aren't connected, it's all very well to say that Facebook and Twitter are going to change the world, but at a time when I would venture to say 95% of people in India are probably not using it, may not have even heard about it. So how far is that going to go?
We can overstate this even in situations where it did get a lot of attention. So Bahrain, the protesters did not prevail.
Absolutely not.
Iran was actually the first poster child of the Twitter revolution. And you have to accept that though it perhaps may have helped contribute to sustained global interest for 2 or 3 months, in the end, the authorities' crackdown worked. So let us not ever assume that a means of communication, even one as exciting and viral and therefore widespread as modern social media, that a means of communication can ever in itself determine an outcome. It can't. Let me say on the same time, and I think I can already sense Hari wants to come in, but just to say that having pointed to the fact that there are limitations, your Indian example may not entirely be the right one. We have an internet penetration rate of about 15% of our population. But a great number of those who are left out of that 15% can have access if they wish. For example, as an MP, I get petitioners coming all the time. And very often they come with things that I need to forward to people. I say, it'll save a lot of time if you can get this to me on email. And they will find an internet cafe, or they will find a friend who has a computer. There are various ways in which people, if they want to use the internet in India, can do so beyond that 15%. Having said that, obviously they're not going to be in some protest square with their SMSs are going to be more important. And in India, from everything to internet banking to using it for other purposes of access, you will find that mobile phones and SMSs will probably always matter more in India than Twitter and Facebook.
At least for the moment, right? Things could change at a certain period of time. What's happening with the Occupy Wall Street movement, which you've been closely associated with? Obviously, Occupy Dalal Street doesn't seem to have had quite the same effect. But
I mean, Occupy Wall Street is a very interesting phenomenon in that essentially it's provided a focus for a sentiment and a rather sort of inchoate set of feelings about the role of financial institutions and in the global economy. I mean, by being physically present, I mean, let's face it, this would not have the rhetorical and metaphorical power that it does have if there weren't some actual people camped in tents in the shadow of the great towers of the banks of downtown Manhattan and actually right next to the World Trade Center site, which is another sort of dimension to this. But the Occupy Wall Street movement has its force because it's virtually present. And is a sort of available for use. It's available as a sort of set of ideas and it's available to people globally through things like the hashtag Occupy Wall Street. It's stimulated a huge debate. There's the criticism that's been leveled by many people so far at this movement is that there's not a program. There's not a set of demands. It's not attempting to interface with legislators in order to bring about determinate things. But in a certain way, it's actually gained a sort of snowballing force by not making a particular set of demands, by kind of being this sort of magnet for which a lot of unspoken things about income inequality, can be uttered and expressed. I mean, what's happening now with it is that it's I think it's now got a secure foothold in New York, but the attempts to set up physical presences in most other American cities have been squashed, in some cases quite brutally. I mean, in Oakland, for example, where interestingly most of the protesters were black and Latino, the police action was extremely heavy-handed, extremely violent, and the police and the mayor who sent those police in were very, very shocked by the wave of reaction that they got from cell phone video and all the things we've become accustomed to from street protest, kind of being fed around the world, and then a great deal of anger coming to them.
You're talking about unspoken things being said, but sometimes there are unspeakable things that are also very easily disseminated through social media, including comments like that, which I'm just seeing flashing up on the screen. It's absolutely, live and instant criticism as you go on. But one of the problems, Shashi, and I'm sure you must be exposed to this a lot, is the fact that on Twitter, on Facebook, you have people who can come out and say stuff which normally you wouldn't be able to express. That includes personal criticism. It could include disseminating things like bigotry, like hatred, like, and that is something that we have to figure out how to deal with. Do you get riled when people are constantly tweeting you and saying all sorts of horrible stuff?
No, I think I've developed a slightly thicker skin over time, but the fact is that, all media are liable to misuse. It so happens that some media are more regulated than others, though there was a time last year when I was not sure that you guys in the electronic media were particularly more responsible than the most brazen troll on Twitter. The fact is that some self-restraint has to come. On Twitter, on the internet generally, on the comment boards of blog sites or of articles posted even by mainstream media on the web, you find a lot of abusive stuff. And that is partly because people can take shelter behind some anonymous handle, which you can't do in real life. You won't go up to somebody and say something nasty. In fact, I have actually been at conferences where people have come up to me and been absolutely unctuous. And when they gave me their names, it turned out to be people who were abusing me on Twitter. So this is life. I mean, this is how our country, they would not say it to you face to face. But then that's the very point. Does it matter? Because beyond the point, they're using it to vent. And unless you allow it to rile you and hurt you and provoke you into saying something that itself can damage you, sticks and stones can break my bones, but their tweets can never hurt me.
But if Twitter, new media, social media can become the catalyst for revolution in some cases, it can also become a catalyst for certain negative thoughts congregating, coming together, being expressed. Like religious hatred, you normally would not find that being openly expressed the way you do sometimes on forums like Twitter.
Free speech is free speech. People can misuse free speech to, is this my mic on? People can misuse free speech to call out fire in a crowded cinema. Mike?
You heard those sounds at the back when...
Is that my mic blowing up?
It did sound as if there was an amplifier problem.
Back up. Okay, I will face you, sir. And yeah, you can misuse free speech to shout fire in a crowded cinema, but that's no reason to place limits on free speech other than the ones that arise socially. There are always attempts to legislate against certain kinds of offensive speech. People feel in many contexts that they have a right to have their sensibilities protected from offense. But that's often a slippery slope towards a kind of censorship that has dire social consequences. Having said that, though, I mean, this thing of trolling on the internet and people being able to express nasty sentiments and to gain kind of confidence in doing that can become a very serious phenomenon. The Chinese have a phrase which translates as the human flesh search engine, and which is a word for this phenomenon where somebody is seen to have done something terrible. So there was a video in China of some people drowning puppies, I think it was, and a lot of people very, very angry about this. And gradually the Chinese internet, became more and more incensed, and a kind of witch hunt was conducted against these people. You see it with certain people involved in murder cases, for example. The public makes its often ill-informed judgment, and and a kind of mob sensibility prevails. But in a way, the cure for this kind of misinformation is usually more information rather than less. It's better sourced, more authoritative, better expressed information. That's almost always the way to counter this kind of thing.
The thing is, does bad information drive out good? Because obviously reputation management can be affected by this kind of stuff on the internet. And there are people who live in fear of false things being said about them or nasty things being said about them on the internet, which gain more traction than the truth. This is a problem, and I'm not quite sure that there is any simple way out. We acknowledge the problem, but in fact, as you said, regulation is going to do far more harm unless it's so light that it won't make a difference.
So one is that wrong information can get traction, can go viral, and can spread really, really fast. The second is that a small group of people can make their voice seem much louder than it really is. And again, I'm sure you must be noticing that on Twitter. There are some people who seem to have nothing to do but to spend the entire day tweeting you. And because those 5 or 6 people are sending so many comments in a particular direction, you may think that's what the public is saying, but actually it's 5 or 6 people.
That's why God invented the blocking button.
The blocking button, do you use the blocking button?
No, I haven't used it much. I tell you, to some degree, listening to these characters, you know, what's interesting is that I have half a dozen sort of very, with all respect to Mr. Gadkari, if his minions are still around, very BJP-inclined people who do this quite regularly, and I'll get, 15, 20 tweets a day from these guys. I don't see all the tweets, but when I do, what I sometimes do to slightly disarm them is reply to one of the more innocuous of their tweets, taking them
I
seriously.
could probably name the people by now. I'm sure you could too.
You probably can. And the fact is that often changes their discourse. They suddenly become more civil because I've chosen to engage with them. So I've not engaged with their abusive stuff, but when they ask a reasonable question that is not particularly in and of itself offensive, except they asked it, I may actually reply and thereby get them back into the conversation. And that has worked with a number of people.
I think that's a fascinating piece of psychology, actually, and I think, and I'd back that up completely. I mean, it's my experience that people are often very abusive because they don't really feel emotionally that there's a human being at the other end. It's just you're typing into a keyboard and there's some sort of response from your computer. But when they're made to realize that they're actually dealing with another human being, often the normal rules of civility kick back in. You find that on the comments page of, I write journalism sometimes, and the comments can get kind of vile and ugly underneath. And you go into the comments, and then suddenly everybody's nice as pie and feeling quite pleased that you've made a response. It's an odd turn that happens.
Okay, so new psychology has to kick in there. I just want to shift the focus a little bit and come to writing itself and how that might
May
change.
I, before we leave the Facebook, just one quick word for people in India who may not be fully aware that things like Twitter and Facebook have actually also shown a very unexpected positive side in areas like disaster relief. Haiti earthquake, 70 million tweets on the Haiti earthquake within a week of that earthquake. The Japan tsunami. Twitter became a method of mobilizing relief. There's now ways in which social network sites have simplified the task of finding missing people. Google has invented a thing called People Finder. You tweet information about people who are missing. Other people tweet information about where they might be seen. It's actually turned out to be a huge blessing in terms of disaster management. I read about a case in which people had to be evacuated from a hospital after the Fukushima disaster in Japan, and they tweeted the American ambassador. Now imagine, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, how would you reach the American ambassador? The guy has a Twitter account. So he immediately contacts the US military, which contacts the Japanese self-defense forces. The 30 patients in critical condition are evacuated. Twitter mobilizing troops, finding solutions. I don't want us to leave it purely as triviality. There's a lot of serious good work that's emerging from modern media as well that's actually helping change lives.
I think that's right, and I think certainly in some areas and in some professions as well, it's a very, very powerful tool for any of us. For journalists, for example, it's quite often becoming your first source of information about something, and you're getting information right from the ground, which you then have to sometimes curate. You can't completely believe everything that you're hearing, but you do often get to keep track of what's happening faster and better on Twitter than you do elsewhere.
And I remember when I tweeted a disaster in my constituency, a poor girl who got run over by a train and lost her legs, 12th grade, about to miss her exams, family in desperately poor conditions. The number of offers who helped that poured into her, and she's getting new legs and transforming her life. As a result, frankly, am I getting the word out on Twitter?
That's fantastic. But you have as your bio on Twitter saying that you use social media to avoid having to do serious work, or words to that effect. Just tell us how. I mean, how can you transform writing a book into 140 characters?
Well, you can't. I mean, they're different forms. My slightly tongue-in-cheek bio is that it's a work avoidance tool, and there is something, a serious discussion to be had about concentration. I mean, when you're kind of buffeted by streams of media input in various forms, it's very hard to clear that mental space that you need to write fiction, which involves a sort of sustained meditative state of mind. And on a bad work day, I can spend all my time pretending it's absolutely vitally important for me to keep up with whatever the news story of the day is by following 50 new people on Twitter or making Facebook posts or whatever it is, instead of doing what I'm supposed to be doing. So it seems to be one of the key tools of modern life and productivity, is to know when you're on and when you're off. And I make a point of being off completely at certain times, and there is at those times a sense of profound pleasure and relief.
Right. Is there an element of strong creativity that can come into that in 140 characters? I guess it has happened in the past. We used to have haiku once upon a time, or haiku still exists, of course. Is this the haiku of the modern era? Trying to be as creative as you can in as few characters as possible?
I don't know. I think the character restraints limits creativity beyond a certain point. Though I gather Salman Rushdie has just done a limerick on Kim Kardashian, which is all the rage of Twitter. So I suppose you can.
That's so Salman, isn't it?
And that's so Salman. I mean, but you can, but not, I think, very seriously. There is something called Tales on Tweet going around, asking people, famous writers and others, for stories of less than 140 characters, and some of those are up there. I mean, it can be done, but only up to a point. I think really it's more an information medium. I'd rather see, as we are seeing, the Indian Ministry of External Affairs or the Post and Telegraphs Department or even the Delhi Police going on Twitter to give important, necessary, useful, immediate information, rather than us trying to turn it into a form of literature.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I must confess not to being terribly interested in most of the literary attempts that have been made on Twitter. I think I concur almost completely that it's about flow and it's about information, and it is about that extraordinary moment when you realize you have direct access to the desktop of somebody very distant and perhaps very powerful. As somebody who wants to be involved in the conversation about, what is the good, how should we live, as all writers in some form want to be, Twitter is interesting. And there's a pleasure in the well-crafted 140-character utterance. There's no doubt about that. You can turn a good joke in that space. But I think it's less about a sort of lapidary work than it is about process and about the propagation and proliferation of ideas and information through the world.
Sometimes it also seems to me that it's essentially about marketing, and for many people, Twitter or Facebook, their Facebook pages are as much about the marketing of their new book, their new movie, their whatever they are doing, a party that they are having. Is it somewhere starting to morph into that? It's not so much about revolution as about marketing.
Well, it's both. I mean, I think, frankly, people will not be marketed to unless they're interested in reading you in the first place. So if all you're offering is marketing, they lose interest in you and you won't be able to market to them. Common sense. So if you're also using your Twitter handle to try and actually communicate interesting observations, thoughts about yourself, information they might not otherwise have, then tomorrow when you plug your next Bollywood blockbuster, maybe they will also pay attention to that. But if you've already lost them earlier, you won't get them. One thing about the character limit and writing that I would have liked to have added is that you can use things like Twitter for links, you see. So you write a beautiful piece of lapidary prose in your journalism hurry, and then you just tweet a link, so you don't have to get your wisdom into those 140 characters.
Yeah, I mean, if it's anything, it's a ruthless free market of interestingness. Yeah. People will follow or unfollow and pay attention or not depending on whether what you're saying is actually of interest to them. And I find that phenomenon fascinating, what actually attracts people, what bores them. And it's often slightly humbling. Yes, your wonderful, well-turned utterance falls into profound silence, and then the thing you tweet about Kim Kardashian gets 100,000 people.
But you know, Shashi, I have to say that a lot of people were starting to say that Twitter is going to be a very democratic tool. Everyone gets their voice out there. But actually, if you think about it, the people who are really tending to get followed a lot are people who are already well known in offline spheres. You know, if you look at the top tweeters in India, most followed is what you, Priyanka Chopra, Shah Rukh Khan.
Sachin Tendulkar, yeah.
Sachin Tendulkar. The people who are only on Twitter would be lucky to get 5,000, 6,000, 8,000 followers.
That may
You have
be
1.5 million.
true. I personally have tried to follow some quote-unquote ordinary folks who sent me an interesting tweet or whatever, and I looked at some of the other stuff they've been tweeting, and I followed them. So I have a mixture. I suspect most people do, actually, and everyone will follow personal friends who may not be household words themselves. But yes, it's often the individual tweet by somebody with 10 followers that is picked up by somebody with 1 million followers that can make an impact. Probably you're right there.
Okay, the first bell has rung, so just before we leave, to again shift the focus a little bit, I just wanted to ask you both as authors, how concerned are you about a different type of new media, the fact that it's all moving digital onto iPads? Is that going to completely destroy models? I had people who were reading Walter Isaacson's biography of Steve Jobs in perfect EPUB format on their iPads minutes after it was released because somebody had pirated it on the internet. We've seen this obviously already in movies, in music. Is the publishing industry about to change completely?
Well, yeah, clearly the publishing model is changing completely, and the downside of easy copying is, of course, piracy and perhaps loss of revenue for creative people. The upside is a kind of a possibility of a much more direct relationship between the reader and the writer. I mean, the people who need to be very worried about this are large publishing firms who depend on physical distribution for their revenue. I mean, the people I don't need to be financing are a large old-fashioned marketing department and a fleet of trucks to take physical books around. At the point where I can perhaps write a Word document and place it for sale on an interface that I own and manage, then really all you're into a very pure kind of information business. So there are strong upsides there. You're already seeing this in some fiction publishing where a few admittedly already well-established genre writers, a couple of thriller writers in particular I can think of, have declined to sign conventional publishing contracts with advances and instead opted to self-publish effectively and distribute through Amazon or iTunes or one of the other available portals. And that means they can take 70 or 80% of cover price rather than a 10% royalty, and hence clearly need to sell much fewer units in order to make a living. And and if it's just a question of supporting me rather than sending the head of marketing on a nice vacation to the Maldives, then your overheads are smaller.
All right, Shashi, we are about 5 seconds away from the final bell, so any closing comments from you?
No, I'd just say that I think that social media is obviously here to stay, that we overestimate its impact sometimes, I think, at our own peril, but we certainly should not underestimate it. Some might suggest there's information overload. There's something like 140 million tweets a day, 1 billion a week. So obviously that's more than any human being is ever capable of digesting. But I think that also represents an opportunity for those who actually want to use it constructively. And that's, for example, why I think I'm glad that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in India is using it and other government bodies. I hope that more and more our governance takes advantage of these means of communication to increase accountability and transparency of our democracy. At balance, in a democracy, social media can be an asset if we use it well.
Shashi Tharoor, Kunzru, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.